Welcome to Journeys with the No Schedule Man, exploring authentic stories of personal growth and lessons learned from people living true to themselves with creativity, passion, and purpose. For all past episodes, subscribe at iTunes or visit noscheduleman.com. And please connect, share, and contribute with a comment, rating, or review. And now, here's your host, the No Schedule Man, Kevin Bulmer.
I've been known to struggle with reality. Not that it is any real mystery.
The question this week is, how long are you willing to work for overnight success? And once you think you've found it, how can you be sure? Welcome. I'm Kevin Bulmer. This is Journeys with the No Schedule Man, helping to create positive change by exploring and sharing authentic conversations on personal and professional growth. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to continue the conversation and have daily access to me, I invite you to join me in my online coaching community. It's called the Turtle Tribe, and it's a place where you'll get daily coaching, hints, tips, encouragement, empowerment, and creative collaboration. It's a membership-based community, but there is a free 7-day trial so that you can ensure that it's a good fit for you. You'll find everything you need at theturtletribe.com. Have a look and see if it's for you. We'd certainly love to have you. Today, we're joined by Greg Schinkel, president of Unique Training and Development and certified speaking professional. And Greg's story is a clear example of the value and the reality of process, both in business and in life, and what it really takes to become a great leader and to have any chance at becoming what we might refer to as an overnight success. A little bit about Greg. Through Unique Training and Development, Greg and his team offer frontline leadership training for business managers, team leaders, and supervisors. They help with a variety of core topics, including things like the expectations of a frontline leader, leading by example, motivating and engaging employees, effective communication, leading change, managing conflict, correcting unacceptable behavior and performance, and a whole lot more. As the president of Unique Training and Development since 1992, Greg's got a vast amount of experience to draw upon, and the first-hand perspective of somebody who has helped lead a number of businesses through positive change while having to navigate his own personal and professional challenges along the way, as we all do at some point. In addition to his work with Unique Training and Development, Greg is, as I mentioned, a certified speaking professional. He's the author of What Great Supervisors Know and co-author of Awakening the Workplace and Employees Not Doing What You Expect. Now that one, Employees Not Doing What You Expect, reached number 2 on the Globe and Mail Business Bestseller list in May of 2010. Greg is also the author of the Leader Feeder podcast, which you can find on iTunes. Now, the work that Greg does through Unique Training and Development is directed toward business. His story and his experiences will be relatable and valuable to anyone trying to discover and maintain a path to sustainable success. Among the key things I took away from my time with Greg include how the art of business development has changed. This was an interesting discussion, and it was laced with some ironies, as you'll hear in the conversation. In a lot of cases anymore, it's about making an emotional connection. People are looking for helpful content as evidence of experience and expertise. In other words, in terms of business development, it seems now much more about how you make people feel that may open the door to opportunity. And I would venture to say that's true in our personal lives as well. So if you've got slogans and gimmicks and hook lines and strategies, I still see a lot of people in businesses using those. But authenticity seems to be at the forefront. It's a lot about how you make people feel anymore. It was interesting to hear Greg's thoughts on that related to business. Another key point, the downside to grow at all costs as a strategy. I've often wondered about this, as I've never really understood why a business or a certain geography, sometimes you'll hear cities promoting themselves as the fastest growing, but I've never understood why anyone would promote them as the fastest growing anything, because by its very nature, that's a bubble that has to burst at some point. It's finite. You can't be the fastest growing forever. So why would you hang your flag on that? It's not a long-term strategy upon which you can rely. You're going to have to change. And Greg gives a really clear and very personal example of how this was the case for him, and there's a lot of value in that story. Another point that really stood out to me was the importance of a good feedback loop and the willingness to be open to asking for and accepting help. Greg said that he thought that he had to solve all the challenges that he came upon on his own. This is something that I've had to realize about myself as well. He found out differently through trial and a lot of error, and he also discovered the incredible value of taking in different perspectives and getting feedback offered by consistent and constructive processes that would allow him to be able to see things in different ways and how valuable that could be. Greg also talked about the upside of adversity, which also fits right into the wheelhouse of what I talk about in my Rise Like a Phoenix, Race Like a Turtle keynote and workshop. Greg talked about how once you've gone through the fire, you've really made your way through some adversity, your mindset tends to change after that, mostly to your advantage. He tells a story about this, and he offers some valuable perspective about how and why that change happens. He also talked about what to look for in leadership and the truth about people who are abrasive or aggressive. Greg provided some really valuable perspective on how to evaluate the leadership traits in you or in your company or organization. And also, he outlined some what I thought were really interesting experiences when it comes to the truth about people who are the most outwardly aggressive and what might really actually be going on inside of them. Greg talked about change as a process rather than being an event. Training, going to a workshop, going to a seminar, that's an event. But real change, that's a process. As Greg said, people are too quick to give up on something. Keep doing something long enough to have some residual impact. A lot of good things to take away. Whether you're just looking to improve yourself or you're in a business or organizational setting, you're going to get a lot of great information from Greg Schinkel. Here he is sharing a true story about leadership in business and what it really takes to be an overnight success on Journeys with the No Schedule Man. Greg, how does what you're doing now compare to what you thought you might be doing back when you were a boy and envisioning your future?
Oh, great question, Kevin. When I go back to what I thought I would do, I honestly thought I would become an engineer, not the train driving kind, but probably an engineer working in an automotive company, because my dad had worked in automotive and he had kind of told me how great engineering was, even though he wasn't an engineer. So this really has not much to do with it, except that I get to work alongside a lot of people in manufacturing with the business that we have.
What about what you do now, though, appeals to that original part of you that was so interested in being an engineer?
That's a good question. And lately, one of the experts I listen to is Dan Sullivan, and he has a program called Strategic Coach. And one of his questions is, what is your unique ability, the essence of who you are? And it's something you were good at when you were a kid. It's something you were good at as a young adult. It's something you might be good at when you're 80 years old or something, right? And so that made me think back to what was it about, when I was, 7, 8, 9 years old, and then a teenager, and then a young adult, and now, what is that? And, one of the things that I was, ever since I was a young kid, I was really into, I liked giving presentations. Everyone else dreaded giving presentations. I liked giving presentations, and I liked hamming it up and being in the school play, and eventually doing a little bit of radio in high school and then a little bit in college. And I was thinking, so that part, I think it still feeds me. And because I didn't mind being outgoing, I think it helped, when I had to do some business development or sales things too. So definitely I go to that sort of more extroverted, outgoing, persuasive stuff. And I was thinking that was the common thread that I think exists even today.
What's an example, Greg, of something that you found that maybe you were not as good at that you needed to improve upon in order to do what you do?
Well, because I can be a bit of a goofball sometimes, so I had to realize that there's when we talk about authenticity, that there's a certain kind of authentic self I think people are willing to accept. So I realized that there's a difference between some of my oddball thinking and humor and what audiences might appreciate. So I guess when I go back, in terms of what was probably missing at that point, is I don't think I really had a good sense of how decisions got made, how things ran, what businesses did. Those were things I had to work on as I went along in order to get kind of an appreciation for them as opposed to disdain.
That's an interesting word. To what extent did you ever feel disdain for those things?
Well, I didn't grow up in a household that was kind of overly anti-business. My dad had a long career at General Motors, and so he was always positive about business. And he actually started a business going back to 1977, so I would have been 10 years old at the time. So he was bringing sort of entrepreneurial thinking into the room, but I just didn't, or into the house. But I didn't think much at that point about businesses or whether they were evil or good. And certainly I never received programming in my mind that says, businesses are bad. But I just didn't kind of understand how that stuff went. And now I'm really, I'm going to say, well, first of all, I love the concept of businesses and I don't see them as being evil. And it worries me when people sometimes see them as being, totally corrupt or totally only focused on profits and not on other outcomes. So I think, my thinking about what businesses are and what companies are and what corporations are has probably evolved a lot in terms of being more positive and just appreciating the significance of some of these enterprises.
Let's talk a little bit about how this path evolved. There certainly was a family aspect to it, wasn't there?
Yeah, so my dad had after being an executive at GM, and even when I think of high school, so back when I thought I'd be an engineer, I graduated from high school, or as I was going to graduate from high school, I was looking at post-secondary, university, college, and my dad, having been at General Motors, said, hey, just so you know, there is a General Motors Institute or a General Motors University. And so he said, if you want to apply to it, it's in Michigan, and you have to get a job at a GM facility in order to go to school there. And what GMI at the time, it's now called Kettering University in Flint, Michigan, but at the time they had kind of two streams of study. They had the engineering side, and then they had a business side. So even back to when I was applying to go to university, it was like, so do I go on the engineering side? Now I'd gone through, and of course in Ontario, the province of Ontario in Canada, at that point we had, we called it grade 13. It was kind of like this extra year thrown on after a senior year in high school. And so, we have to do some more challenging courses. And what I guess what I learned at that point is either I wasn't willing to work hard enough at, math and science. It was okay. Like I did okay at it. But I thought, boy, if I'm going to go and study this as an engineering student, that's going to be like way more intense. And in fact, going to that GM university at that time, that was even taxing as a business student, because a lot of the studies really tried to be both good for business students and for engineering students. So even the first year courses I found a bit challenging. But then, going to get a job at General Motors, and I had my dad as a connection, which certainly helped. And so I went to St. Catharines, which is where he grew up. A lot of his youth was spent in St. Catharines, and he worked at General Motors in St. Catharines. So he at least got me in there for an interview, and then it turned out okay. They hired me, and so I went to school in Michigan and worked at General Motors. And when I think about just making that choice, up till then I'd grown up in London, stayed in London. We didn't move much in London, Ontario, Canada, and then now off to Michigan to study, and off to the Niagara area where Niagara Falls is, to work. And so that was just a great experience. Plus I got to wander around a factory as an older teenager and start getting exposed to factories, which is still the people that I relate to today in my work.
What did you learn about yourself at that time that has translated into something that you carry with you now?
So one of the things I think about is, and I did pretty well in school, and at the time school, aside from that first year with a lot of science classes, I learned that I was really good in discussions. The business school I ended up moving. So once I decided that I was not going to see myself as having a career with General Motors, I actually transferred to the Ivy Business School at the University of Western Ontario. And what I learned there is the case study method with discussion, and where there were points for participation. I really learned that I could really handle myself in a discussion, and that I could kind of feed off of that. And I will say that's true even today when I'm working with a customer or a client, and you need to have good ideas that come out of the conversation. I find that both energizing, but I also think I'm pretty good at it. And so kind of the extended amount of preparation I might have thought you had to have to be successful turned into really being kind of more intuitive.
That's really interesting to me, to hear somebody have the realization that they were good at discussion, to use your word. I'm curious about what that looks like and looked like in your mind of, even just breaking down discussion, Greg, of how much of that would have been contributing to it and how much of that would have been listening.
Well, I think if you asked my wife whether I'm a good listener, you'd get a laugh. In fact, she'd say, "You teach listening skills, don't you?" And it's true that I do teach aspects of listening. What's funny is with clients, and I suppose even with business stuff, I'm going to say business type topics. When I'm really interested or engaged, and I tend to be more interested and engaged probably in things that are more novel or new, because it really piques my curiosity. And I would say, by the way, that curiosity is another one of those core things that I can even trace back to being a kid. And so being curious in a conversation, I guess, allows, at least and for me, it allows my mind to be open to the possibilities and get kind of excited about that. So it's really feeding off of the thing that the other person has said. So I definitely have to still work on listening skills, but I would say that if I'm really interested in the particular subject or issue, it really sparks my, I suppose, my creativity and my curiosity.
At this point, it sounds to me, Greg, like you had recognized at a time previous that you had good presentation skills, you enjoyed that you recognized you were good at discussion, which is similar, but different. They can be separate things, certainly. I would say in presentation there's more of the talking side than the listening side, isn't there? Although there has to be listening either before or during, or anyway. You've got the background with the love of engineering. You've recognized that you like factories, manufacturing environments, and are curious about a lot of things. How did all of that come together to develop into what ended up becoming your role with Unique Training and Development?
Well, again, so my father, going back to 77, when I was about 10 years old, he was still working as an executive at GM, but he knew that someday he'd probably like to get into business for himself. And so he bought a training franchise. Now, back in those days, corporate training consisted of a big briefcase full of cassette tapes and a binder. And, you might have come to some group sessions, but you did a lot of self-study. And as he likes to point out, back in those days, trying to convince especially smaller companies to invest in training their staff was an uphill battle. Like, you really had someone who was enlightened. So, I'm 10 years old. I'm barely paying attention, but I got to go to his office and hang out and hear his stories and see some of the guys that he was hiring as associates and that sort of thing. And then, fast forward a bit later now. So he eventually sold that business. And then come 1987, he's 55 years old, and he has the opportunity to solicit a package out of General Motors to take early retirement. So at this point, it's 87, so I'm 20 years old. I'm just starting my post-secondary. So there were actually a few years there where I was going to GMI, General Motors Institute, and he was still an executive at General Motors in London, Canada. And so there was an overlap there, but then he decided that in 87 he was going to take an early retirement package. And so he said, I want to get back in the training business, but I don't want it to be a franchise. So he actually started Unique Training and Development at that point, 1987. And so I continued going through my university studies, and when I ended up at the Ivy Business School, I ran their consulting business that they have for doing small business plans for small companies. And then my dad, who now is, he's inching up towards 60, not really old by any case, but he had a pension from GM, and he saw me coming out of business school, and he knew I'd been doing this, running this little small business consulting at Western. And so he thought, if you want to come in, this is an opportunity for you potentially to take over the business. So he had the foresight to have first dabbled in a side business that, even by his own accounts, wasn't super successful, but he was able to sell it. So he was able to get out of that business. Then he started this business, and again, decided to be open enough that I could come in and join him. So after I got out of the Ivy Business School, he basically hired me in, and actually for a little while there, all I did was, and this is, remember, back in the very early days of personal computers. So we were still, I'm going to say, cold calling from a sales perspective. We were cold calling companies out of the Yellow Pages. So for 9 months, I worked on straight commission for him, just prospecting people who might want to buy training services. And I was successful enough. I did actually okay making straight commission. And I thought, all right, well, there's a great 9-month trial that says that I could probably do okay in this business. And then what I didn't know is that he said, I'd like to sell you the company at some point. And then that happened like 6 months later. So I was like, that would have been 1992. And I'd only come out of school in the summer of 91. I had done that 9 month of cold calling on commission a couple of years earlier when I was in transition from General Motors to going to the Ivy Business School. So he's like, okay, I want to sell you the company. And then literally 6 months later, we went to see the lawyer, and he sold me the shares. So 92, I'm 25 years old, and I have president on my business card. And I thought I knew a lot, but it turned out, as I'm sure we'll go into, I didn't really know a lot. And so it was an interesting ride for the first 12 or 13 years.
I definitely want to come back to that. I just wrote down, I thought I knew a lot. 25 years old. If you would indulge me for a moment before we dive further into that, Greg, tell me a little bit more about the cold calling. So here's a guy that, as we went over a moment ago, is good at presentations, likes discussions, but, had an eye toward engineering. And now all of a sudden you've got a phone in your hand and a Yellow Pages on your desk. How did you get started, and what did you say?
Well, first of all, I do want to point out that one of the gifts my dad gave me, which I'm very appreciative of, is he taught me how to sell. So at that time, we were doing sales training. We don't do that anymore. But at the time, we did sales training. And so he let me take a sales training course. So I learned kind of at least the mechanics or the techniques around it. And then, he said, well, basically, because, the business was established, but it wasn't really like deeply established. Had been around for a few years. So he says, there's the phone book, and we had a script. And he said, so kind of use this script and then adapt it as you want to. And, for anyone who's ever done any sales or business development or prospecting or cold calling, not very many people really love it. But, what we learned is that you just have to dial the phone, that, a no will lead to yes eventually. And at that point, I didn't really have a lot at risk. It's not like I saw this as being, oh my gosh, if I'm not good at this, I'll never be able to work. So I just viewed it as, hey, this is kind of interesting. I didn't know how it would work. And then, that people would actually be willing to have appointments, because what was starting to happen there is companies were now starting to invest in training their teams. So the idea of even investing in your staff was starting to mature a little bit. It was starting to get seasoned. So I was actually not having 10 no's for every yes. I was getting 3 or 4 out of every 10 would say, sure, I'll have a meeting with you, and then would go into doing the selling. And I just thought there was a thrill that came with closing a deal or getting an order, and that I started to love too. In fact, when I look at today in my business development, I love the business development side of what we do. and I can trace it back to those early experiences and wins, picking up that telephone and making those phone calls.
I'm jumping us forward a bit, but how does that compare with how business development is done with your company today?
Oh, very, very different. Probably should still pick up the phone more than I do, but one of the things that's definitely changed is because most people will start their buying journey with a Google search. Even that's what I'll do when I'm looking at buying something. So what we get now as a company, and again, when my colleagues say, "Oh, how do you get so many business leads and inquiries?" and I say, "Well, it helps to be around for 25 years and have a website that has all this content on it, because when people then search for, say, supervisory training or supervisor training manufacturing or something like that, we're going to pop up as one of the top choices because we've been in that business so long." So I will say that now we're blessed with having a lot of inbound inquiries, and also just when you're in business long enough, eventually people start saying, "Hey, you should really talk to these guys if you want to train your supervisors." So I would say it's very different now. And I will also say that back then, face-to-face, in-person appointments were crucial. And now I'd say that some of the largest projects that we work on often don't have any face-to-face contact until the project gets underway. So there's a lot more business done through emails and through like I even think as a company we used to have to buy letterhead and stuff, and now it's all done, of course, with PDF documents, and there's seldom the need for sending anything physical to a customer. So it's really a lot more, I would say it's a lot more open to transacting business without all the formalities that there used to be.
That's really interesting about less face-to-face. You gave a lot of context about some of what a quarter century will do for you in terms of accumulating content and reputation, referrals, positive word of mouth, and all of those kinds of things. But what do you think some of these people are looking for in terms of, searching for the right words here, Greg, getting the right impression and satisfying themselves that they can investigate that level of commitment without meeting face-to-face? How do you think they're gauging that? What are they looking at and judging?
That's a really insightful question. And I think first of all, they're looking to see if whatever is written, recorded, or published kind of seems to indicate some degree of expertise or experience. And then they're also looking for, and we continue to try to beef this area up, they're looking for, I guess, testimonials of people who may have already done work with. So certainly the existing client list probably helps establish that. And then I think they're just trying to get a feel, which sounds bizarre, but these days with the use of apps and web media and internet, it's just that I think they get a feel for your personality from the various evidence that you leave behind. So, and then that seems to create some degree of reassurance. And then I find that when they do get on the telephone and they want to find out more information, then it's all about every interaction after that, from the emailing. I've personally found that so that it's not just this anonymous person sitting in an office in a different country perhaps than where they are. I really believe it's about making some sort of an emotional connection or hook with them early on that sort of humanizes what is basically a very inhumane way of really having a relationship, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, Greg, in that all of the material that comes together to represent an individual or an organization is created by someone or some collection of experiences. And what I'm hearing from you is it sounds as if there's a process, like you called it, just getting a feel of a personality, the evidence that's left behind, and then once the face-to-face or the phone conversations take place, you would have a better sense of whether there's a congruency there or whether you're just being told what the other party thinks that you want to hear. And I think there's a big difference between the two. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, because even though if I'm the one providing the service or selling the service, really it's me trying to get them, I suppose, to like, know, and trust me and respect me. But really it's also happening in reverse, right? Because I'm looking to work with clients that are going to be easy to work with, good to work with, where we're not going to have a lot of aggravation. So I'd say that there's probably a mutual getting to know each other through those communications and responsiveness. So if a client isn't going to be as responsive to me, then it's going to be harder for me to be as enthusiastic to be responsive with them, I suppose.
I'm asking, when I asked the last question, which was really more of a statement than a question, Greg, I had this voice in my mind saying, Greg already knows this, he already feels this way. Why are you following up in this sense? But I think it's because, Greg, I continue to be amazed how much is still, I'll say, out there, for want of a much more effective term, of, for instance, picking up the phone to cold call and your script basically being some version of, what do I need to do to get you into a training development program today? And it's so, you're describing content, you're describing evidence, history, relationships, communication, and I still see so many approach it from, the other sales as if it's some sort of a parlor trick. But there isn't, that's never proven to be a very deep well in my experience, which is what makes it all the more curious to me that I see so many people trying to dip back into it. Or is it just me?
No, it's very insightful that you make the observation, because in today's, I've told clients or prospective clients, I've said, look, when you look at the bullet points that we have in our training program and you compare them to the bullet points in someone else's training program, there's not a whole lot of difference there. So I'm already telling them that, look, pretty much the content is going to be similar. It's going to be delivered in a different way. It's going to have different context, experiences, and style attached to it. And there's different people who have different know-how that might help them relate better to your team. I said, but really, those are the things that make things different. So there's nothing I can really just send to you that will automatically differentiate me in your eyes, but it's really the feel that we get about the approach and some of that uniqueness that I guess would make us different. So you're right. I still think, we do hear from our clients and from prospective clients that they really like the fact that we don't seem to be preaching sort of a canned solution, even though, interestingly enough, that most of the solutions are quite similar. But it's the way it feels when you're, I guess, buying it. So, yeah, it's an interesting observation.
Well, it's a breath of fresh air. I'd love to have this conversation deeper with you over a coffee sometime, and that I really feel like we're in an interesting time for businesses, Greg, anybody that has a service or a product to offer to the market, where in this, keyword-driven economy, I often feel that people either want or think they want something new or revolutionary, but they want it communicated to them in a way that is familiar and comfortable.
Yeah, I think you're right. You're onto something there, and that phrase you used, keyword, that's a powerful phrase. You got to trademark that one.
Well, but everything is a how-to, right?
Yeah.
And though there are solutions, to use your words, that universal is not the phrase that I'm looking for, but common concerns that a lot of us face in work and in life. Everybody's situation is just a little bit unique, which ironically ties right back into your name.
Well, let's just agree to this. And I remember being back in the days when we did sales training, because I can still remember back to that. And I remember being with a client, and I basically said, there is this wave of commoditization that we're fighting against, because people want to think that everyone's all the same and all generic, but really there are points of difference. But if you're not good at telling people how compelling your points of difference are, they're basically going to assume you're just like everybody else. So I think most of us get surprised when we discover these points of differentiation, and really a lot of the value that we see in what we buy is on those things, the way it made us feel differently, which maybe wasn't even expected or even being sought out, but it's the reason why someone keeps doing business with a company. And I think it's very difficult if you're a business person to think about that, is the emotional experience the customer or client is having in their relationship with you. So I think you're right on that respect.
Not to hold us here, but there's another great irony, I think, Greg, and I agree with you completely when you're talking about how something makes you feel and what the emotional connection is and the vibes that you get as a means of differentiation. And yet, in a large sense, from what you described a few minutes ago, it sounds as if there is evidence that people and organizations are doing that in a manner that a lot of times includes less human interaction up front.
Right. Although what's bizarre is, for instance, a good example of it is if you're browsing on an automotive site to buy a car, or you're visiting an actual dealership site, there's always that little chat bot that comes up and says, "Hi, it's Jane, and I'm here to answer your questions." Well, in truth be told, except maybe at specific hours, there is no Jane. There is no person. It's a robot designed to make you feel like they're there to answer your questions. Now, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I'd heard that they've done studies that people enjoy dealing with these bots because they're helpful. And it's funny that if they had to choose between a human being giving them that kind of feeling or the robot giving them that feeling, they sometimes would opt for the robot. So I think it's, we're in this really interesting time where through artificial intelligence, they're able to substitute these relationships and these feelings that can be created without an actual human being being involved. But I think for most of us, our experience has been much more cold and sanitized than that. But it is interesting where it's going.
Yeah, if you were in your 40s and 50s, in the 80s or late 70s, you didn't grow up with C-3PO and R2-D2 just being considered natural sidekicks.
Exactly.
I wonder if that's a generational thing. Let's go back into your mid-20s, if you'll indulge me. And what you said was, I thought I knew a lot. All of a sudden, you've got president of a company on your business card, as you describe, and you're 25 years old, well-educated, good at discussion, good at presentations. It sounds to me like you had a really great environment provided by your dad and your family to set you up for every success in business. But what immediately comes to mind, Greg, when you think about some of the first instances where you realized you didn't necessarily know as much as you thought you did?
Well, first, when I took on the business, it already had a certain business model, we'll call it, right? Which is a business model is one of those fancy terms sometimes that just basically means how do you make money looking after customers. And our model at that point was we had some salespeople, business development, that would go out and get business, and then we had some guys that would go out and train in the workshops. And at that point, we really did try to be everything to everyone. And it was kind of a mindset. My dad, I'm going to say, established it, but I probably, again, when I say I knew everything, it's because of what you said. I came out having done really well in business school and had enjoyed a lot of success. And I'm going to say life had probably come relatively easy. Despite it, maybe the only thing that wouldn't have been easy was a few health challenges. But basically, then I came out and said, I've got all these business school smarts. I think we can expand the business and open up new geographies and new territories. And so I think in the early days, I didn't have a good feedback loop that said trouble ahead. But the decisions that I was making, and my dad was very good. He was mostly hands off. So he wasn't really second guessing what we're doing. He was impressed that we were going to open up all these new markets and geographies and open offices in different cities. But in the end, I was, by pursuing such a high growth, grow at all cost strategy, it was basically our foreboding as to what might happen, a dozen years later. So I would say that I missed a lot of the early signs. I had what I would call the illusion of success early, and if anything, that probably kept me from being a little bit more insightful and reflective, which was then forced upon me because of some bad business outcomes that happened later on.
What were some of those?
Well, in one of the things that we jumped on in those early days, and some listeners will probably know about this and others might not, but there's a quality standard, a quality system called ISO 9000. Some people know what it is, but basically companies in the mid 90s really got excited about it and became this very frothy, basically this really frothy business opportunity where if you could go and help companies get their quality system documented, and companies were desperate. I can remember going out to California, and before I could even write up the proposal, the guy came in with a check and said, "Here's your check. We need this in 90 days. Can you guys do it for us?" And at that point, I should have realized we were in a bubble, right? But I thought, oh no, this is awesome. We're awesome. So demand outstrips supply, which I thought made us a genius. It just basically meant that the market was quite good there for a little while. And so I thought, oh, we're going to expand the business and capture this business. But then what ended up happening is, as more consultants were able to help companies with their quality systems, and as I'm going to call it the desperation kind of left the market, like people weren't as desperate to get their certification, then what happened is there was now too much supply and not enough demand. And what that did is I had a bunch of guys on salary that, I was counting on selling lots of their time, and then all of a sudden we're not selling as much, so our sales start to drop off. And meanwhile, I had gone into the bank and said, "Hey guys, we got this rapid sales growth. Can you lend me some money?" Because the other thing they don't teach you in business school is that you can basically, through rapid growth, you can become insolvent because you just don't have as much, you need more cash to pay rent and salaries and things before your customers pay you. So anyway, we started borrowing money, but again, it was like, oh no, it's all good. It's all rock and roll. Music's still playing. Everyone's still got a chair to sit in. But come 2000, we were really in tough straits. We'd borrowed money. The business was softening, and the bank started to get concerned. And I'll say this in a talk, so it's not something I'm not prepared to talk about, but I said, the bank put us in special accounts, and that's not for their best customers. That's for the ones that they're worried could go under. And so we were in this limp along mode. So it was all these great business lessons that were so painful, but I had to downsize the business. I had to lay people off. I had to, close offices. I had to do all those things, and the bank was basically watching every month to see that we were within our covenants. And then if I fast forward a few more years, it's now 2004, so I'd owned the business for a dozen years, and finally the accountant said, "Guys, basically you're toast." My dad and I were sitting there, and we went to see a lawyer who specialized in insolvency, and he basically said, "Yeah, you guys are toast." So there we were. It was August of 2004. I had to make the phone call to the banker to say, "Look, things are not good." And I thought at this point, I was honestly thinking, because we had signed personal guarantees for all this debt, that there was going to be, that they were going to seize the house and everything. Now, it was a painful process, but it turns out banks really don't want your house. They just want all the equity out of it. So we were able to cash in all sorts of investments. So basically everything that we had sort of saved and invested and built equity in was essentially wiped out in 2004. But probably more important than that, the business really wasn't even in existence anymore because it was out of business. So at that point, looked at a bunch of different options, including, going back to school to become a professor or just joining one of my clients as a manager or some kind. And ultimately, through some reflection over a couple of months, I said, there is still a core business here, training supervisors, that we kind of strayed away from by this other market opportunity that seems so amazing. I think we could restart this business. So I was able to actually lend my dad $35,000 so that he could essentially restart the company. And then I bought it from him again 2 years later. So I actually bought my company from my dad twice. I won't do it again. The guy's 85. I don't think he can handle it. Right. So, the reality is that very painful business lessons, but really at that point, And since then, so now it's been another 13 years. Since then, the business became very successful. So when people ask me, how can I get the kind of success you guys are having right now? I said, well, you should buy your business from your dad, run it into the ground, realize your mistakes, fix them, refocus the business, stick with it long enough, and then you'll be an overnight success.
You just gave in the last few minutes an absolute masterclass on business and life, and I'm not sure which to unpack first, but I'm inclined to start here. What you described, you can now speak on with the benefit of hindsight and knowing how things were going to work out over the following decade and a half almost. But at that time, that must have felt like a complete and total collapse of your life. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. It was, I'm going to use a nice word. It was heck to go through, right?
Yeah.
So it's funny because if I go back, in the past, I've had health challenges just with my gut, something called Crohn's disease. And as part of that, I actually tended to worry a lot. I'm going back before the business failed and everything. And I remember going to see a psychologist at that time and said, my doctor thinks it would be good for me to meet with you just to kind of be less worrisome, right? And so he took me through a mental exercise, which was, okay, what are some of the things that you tend to worry about that you mull over? And so, it's the usual things. It's, the business will fail. The marriage won't work out, the friends won't have anything to do with you anymore, that sort of thing, right? And then what really stuck with me, and I remember it even now 20 years later, it's like he said, and then what would happen, right? So after you're in this pit of despair, then what would happen? Now his point, of course, was that even if all the things you worried about actually came true and it was that crappy, eventually, you'd find something else to do. You'd find someone else to have a relationship with. You'd have other friends, that sort of thing. So interestingly, that when it actually happened, when the business actually did fail, I would say that although it was super, super stressful, it also, there's a time when you're in adversity, I think, like that. And I can remember, some of those darkest days. I actually remember calling clients of mine who I had good relations with, and I said, hey, do you have enough liquidity that you want to buy my house and rent it back to me? And I still do business with those people today, because it really showed me the value of being more open. I thought I had to solve all problems on my own, and then when I learned that you can reach out to people when you're facing a challenge, they're there to help you. And so, yeah, those were really difficult times, and again, my wife Robin was so supportive at that point, even though it was just hell to go through together. But yeah, I mean, it was worrisome. Like, we had to move out of our office over a weekend and basically leave behind a bunch of office furniture, and we had to let a bunch of people know that their employment was ending, and we had to cash in a lot of our savings. And again, it turned out we didn't need to sell our house. We just had to remortgage it. But all this was going on, and registered letters, and dealing with lawyers, and absolutely, it was very murky at that time. And again, fortunately, my dad was still supportive, and I had friends and family who were there to be supportive. And like you said, there was no guarantee going forward that it'd be successful, but it was an opportunity to really change a lot of the, I'm going to call the bad business model that we were trying to make successful. It was a chance to wipe that clean and start over again, and that really helped. So that's why even today, when I hear of people fretting over their businesses failing or something, or people think companies walk away from their debt, well, there is a reason why those laws exist, and it's because it's meant to really give people another chance to see if they can be successful. So it worked out in our case, but yeah, at the time it was really uncertain.
You've now given some greater context to that moment that I had just brought up, and the question that I was going to ask, I think now has even more weight to it thanks to what you were just kind enough to share, Greg, and that was, and maybe even give a little bit more context to it, if I can ask and invite anyone that's listening right now to think back about a time in their own lives when you were experiencing that much trauma and adversity about something, to have the ability to trust yourself to make the next decision is a tremendous leap for some of us. And so I'm curious to hear more about how you were able to go through that amount of adversity and I'll call it trauma. It certainly sounds traumatic to me, Greg.
Yeah, it was.
And A, trust yourself to make the decision of what to do next, and B, have that decision to be get right back into business in a similar vein. Now, there was a difference. You had mentioned that you had managed to lend your father the $35,000. He restarted the company, and then you bought it back from him. But you were still in this flaming wreckage of a business that you'd built and got into another business, as opposed to the trap door of being a professor. Or how did you know that you could trust yourself to make that work?
Well, I'd love to think that I reflect back on it and I knew with some absolute certainty, but I didn't, right? So with a combination of faith and family and friends and not hiding it too much, I would say that in those days, I wasn't really, of course, using it in my talks like I do today, but it was embarrassing, quite frankly, at the time. So when it came to clients, except for a few very sort of closer clients where I had more of a personal relationship, for most clients, it was just business as usual. So, whatever projects we were working on, we kept working on them. And, we asked them to make their checks payable to a slightly different entity. But essentially, from their standpoint, it wasn't that different. And I still had a couple of team members that came with me during that transitionary time. And so that means we weren't kind of without a team at all. My dad was at that point, wasn't involved in the business, so he was just really a cheerleader and a sounding board. But one thing I can say is, after pre-worrying about the worst thing that can happen, then going through one of the worst things that can happen, I will say that after that, it changes the mindset completely. At least it did for me. So now, once you've experienced a really horrendous business failure and have your personal finances upended, it really kind of de-risks things, because it's not risky. You might say, well, it sounded like it was risky at the time. Well, no, when you have nothing, it's not risky anymore. And even now that we've built up some success, I go back to, if sales are up, great, we'll enjoy a good year. If sales soften a little bit or another recession happens, we're going to be much more nimble and flexible than we used to be. And so, you know what, everything's probably going to work out. I guess that's what it ended up telling me, is that ultimately everything will work out. At the time, of course, there was no guarantees it would work out. But there was still, clients were doing business. It wasn't the middle of a recession. It was all self-imposed, horrendous business decisions. So really, it turned out okay. And there were very dark days there for probably a few months. And then, it started to get a little brighter.
One of the many things that you have noted about yourself on your website is that one of the things you have done and can do is provide coaching to abrasive or aggressive managers, executives, and supervisors.
Yeah.
What's that like when you step into an environment trying to help somebody that very likely does not want to be helped and doesn't think they need it?
You know what? It's interesting, because most people would say, you want to do coaching for abrasive and aggressive defensive managers? And I'd say the only reason why is, well, first of all, when I understand what defensiveness is. So if any, I'm sure everyone who's been listening, or, you at least have someone who's gotten under your skin at some point or has been abrasive or difficult with you. What I learned partly through my own behavior, but also just kind of learning about it, is that when you see people who are abrasive or aggressive, you have to understand that is defensive. When you understand that it's defensive, it means that there's something under the surface that's causing a feeling of inadequacy. So when I have that knowledge, when I'm dealing with somebody who's defensive, as soon as I can help them feel comfortable enough to talk about kind of the stresses and the things that they're going through, I found that they don't exhibit those behaviors towards me anymore. So after doing this for dozens and dozens of managers, executives, sometimes frontline workers, I would say that underneath the difficult, abrasive person is usually someone who is either lacking in self-confidence, self-esteem, or has been hurt in some way. And so when you just have that mindset, it means that you're not going to be affected by their outward behaviors. I'm not suggesting you necessarily go and throw your arms around them and give them a big hug, because they may not be ready for that level of caring. But I just find that not all of them can change, by the way, and some of those reasons why they're defensive run very deep. But yeah, so it's mostly that it doesn't scare me. I always say if somebody's got a weapon, then take cover and run. But if they don't, if the only weapon they have is their voice, their words, then if you can endure that for a little bit longer, you might actually find that they're not as difficult as they seem.
What are some of the things that you see as common or somewhat more common or universal successful traits? Because I know that you've worked across different industries, but in terms of leadership and management in an effective capacity, what are some of the things that you look for that you can immediately spot, okay, this needs to be corrected, or we're lacking this, which I'm pretty sure is going to be a more common sign of turning things around to make it more positive? What comes to mind?
Well, if you're, I guess like anything, there's the kind of what the first impressions are, and then there's the more micro, smaller things that you might observe in individuals. So I would say that the macro things I look for is if there's a lot of agitation in the leadership team, that is, they're overly negative, sarcastic, cynical, if they're using a lot of, not necessarily profanity. I'm not a Puritan by any means, but it's like if the executives or the management in an organization are not respecting the people that work there, and they're being overly negative or cynical or sarcastic about it, that worries me a lot. I also get a sense that for a lot of organizations, the more distant the managers and executives and leaders are from the people who they are supposed to be leading and managing, that also is a negative sign. So when I see people who think, going back to our discussion about technology earlier, when I see people who think that managing by sending emails and texts is going to replace the need to go out and talk to people and ask how they're doing and take some interest in their work, and take the time to show them how to do their work well, then so really basic things where I see that there is not an awareness of the importance of human contact, of spending time with people, of being personable. That would be kind of the early warning stages. And then if you dig a little deeper, you'd get into specific behaviors around, do I play favorites with people? Do I keep my team informed? Do I decide that I'm supposed to solve every problem as opposed to helping the team solve problems? Those then become more individual techniques. They could still be an organizational culture problem, but now you're into more of the tactics that you could do to be a better supervisor or a better leader.
How does your life and day-to-day work differ now from how it did 5 or 10 years ago?
Oh man, it's so much. I'm going to say it's so much more laid back. But I will say this, that because this kind of business can be crazy sometimes, where you win a big project and there's a whole lot of people to train, and that was something that we discovered a few years ago, is that there were some really large pieces of business that we didn't think we'd ever attract or get into. So the only thing now is that sometimes the business can be really busy and involves a lot of travel, a lot of going to different cities, mostly in North America. Otherwise, I'd say my attitude towards the business is kind of laid back, in that because I've lived through the most difficult things, I enjoy it when it's going well. I don't worry too much if it softens a little bit. I don't have the anxiety about that as much anymore. And it's just more fun. Like to me, if you're not worried about whether you can pay your bills at the end of the month, then you're not going to create this desperation feel with clients. And I found that when they get a sense that you're going to do just fine with them or without them, that it's more of a partnership, they seem to be more confident, and it doesn't seem to be as difficult to do business with them. So when they see that I'm not trying to force them to do business with us, that I don't need them to sign this contract by the end of the week to make my numbers for the month, then I think that they just relax. And when we're both relaxed, we can probably come up with better solutions.
What do you enjoy the most about what you're doing now, Greg?
I still, the biggest thrill, because I've been thinking about it as we look to grow the business again. Now, keep in mind that I've got kind of like a rescue dog, always feels like the owner's going to abuse it or something. I still have this memory of 2004, right, when the business failed after I tried to really ramp it up and grow. So what I like most now is the idea of pursuing the opportunities and then sharing them with a group of subcontractor associates. And if we can go out and help a customer together, the thrill for me is really in that business development, trying to find out what the client needs and trying to show them how our solution can work. And then I'd say the other thing that's got my crank turned more these days is realizing that a lot of training workshops, when they get delivered, no matter how much you try to make them not an event, they are an event. But really how people get better at their jobs is more of a process. And so we're looking at what can we do before training and after training to keep people kind of continuing to grow and learn, because it's not like you go to one class or one course and you come out and you've got it all figured out. It's just another sort of element of your leadership journey that you're going on, and we just want to see if we can be more of those guides along that leadership journey, so that we're there when people run into issues and problems and they can get the answers that they need at the time that they need them, as opposed to trying to cram it all into a 2-day class.
How much do you enjoy the, I'll say, somewhat newer in the grander context, technologies that are now available to us? Because you strike me as somebody that embraces learning and the opportunity to dive into things like creating videos, webinars, and online offerings to supplement the in-person interaction. And given that you're talking about the event of a training along with the process of what it takes to change, it sounds like some of those ancillary tools can be very useful. Am I accurate about that you're open-minded and enjoy looking into those technologies?
Well, I enjoy them because it feeds into my curiosity.
Yeah.
But I think what I've noticed in people, including other people that try to do this type of work, is they become very judgmental, like this will never work, or this just doesn't replace the live feel of training. So I always think that if you do have a mindset of curiosity and experimentation, and the other thing I think is that instead of worrying whether a podcast or a newsletter or a video has, a success after 1 month, or, if I look next week and see how did this week's podcast go, I think, what I've seen is people are too quick to give up on something. And I guess I'm going to say I'm just stupid enough, which of course means smart enough, I guess, is to keep doing something long enough to have some residual impact. So if I had worried about writing blog posts and newsletters 15 years ago and how few people were probably reading them at that time, I wouldn't have created the repository of all the stuff that these Google search engines now crawl through, to determine whether I'm an expert in my field. And so I'd say it's 100% certain that everything that we're working on today will probably evolve and change in the future. And some of it is going to have, stand the test of time, and other things will move on. And I think instead of being the sports commentators who judge whether the play was any good, and we have to be willing to try things. And I mean, the more expensive those things are to try, the more difficult it is from a business perspective. But I think taking some steps to experiment and try things, absolutely. In the end, even though most of the revenue still comes from live training workshops delivered at a company, the reality is that I think that companies they're saying, we're not buying training to have training. We want to change the behaviors and the performance of these people. So any way we can do that in the most effective way is really what we're looking for. And by the way, it's not necessarily the cheapest way, but just what is the most effective way? Is it live? Is it a combination of live? And I still think that people think everything is either this or this. Why couldn't it be a blending of it? And so I just think, most of our innovations have come after we stopped being panicked about making our numbers. Most of our successes come when we've just listened to what clients have asked us for, and then try to say, "Oh, that's interesting. Let's give that a try," or maybe that might work. And I've learned the value of being less certain about things, and by being okay with being less certain about things, it's really opened up the possibilities for future growth.
And there's maybe not a great, but somewhat of an irony in a statement like that in terms of what it takes to show effective leadership, wouldn't you say, Greg?
Well, it's funny because a lot of leaders think that they have to come off as being very strong and decisive. But I think most of us, our BS detectors go off when we see somebody who's trying to sell us with some degree of absolute certainty something we know inherently is not certain. And I think the definition of what we see as strong leaders, I think many of us are realizing that we want someone who can be more reflective and open and maybe just be able to express themselves in that uncertainty a little bit more. Because I do think that it's wearing thin on them to see somebody make definitive statements and then read the very next week that it was completely false and wrong, and it's the opposite. So,
Greg, that's there's a lot to consider and unpack, whether whoever is listening is approaching this thinking about their personal life or related to their business. And I would, if you're listening right now, I encourage you to just rewind and go back and listen to everything that Greg said, especially over the last half hour or so again, and make notes. But Greg, that's born from somebody that's been on the front lines and lived it and knows what it takes to become a quote unquote overnight success. Thank you so much for sharing this. I look forward to future conversations where we can take some of the more specific things that came up here over the last hour together and dive into them a little deeper. But in the meantime, you've given me and anyone that has invested in themselves enough to listen to this a lot to consider and act upon. And I'm really grateful to you for that and for your friendship and support since we've met. So thank you for all of it. And I look forward to doing this again.
Kevin, I just want to say to people that the fact that your podcast is Journeys, and I know that you kind of relabeled it recently or in the last couple of years. I just want people to understand the power of understanding, and you as an interviewer helping kind of peel back the layers of the journeys, because I think a lot of people just look at the outcomes and they don't realize the path that people have to take or have taken to get where they're going. And when you realize it's a combination of stuff that you control and other things and luck and circumstances and people, and you realize it really is being kind of just okay on this journey that it's going to turn out. So thank you for bringing that kind of message to your listeners, and appreciate having been able to spend time with you.
If you'd like to connect with Greg or look into the possibility of working with his company, Unique Training and Development, the best place to start is at their website, which is uniquedevelopment.com, www.uniquedevelopment.com. There are a number of social media feeds where you can learn more about Unique Training and Development or follow Greg directly. Look for the Unique Training and Development Facebook page. On Twitter, you can find Greg at LeadershipWiz or at Greg Schinkel. You'll find him on YouTube as well, and I'll put all of those links up with the show notes blog post for this episode, which is number 70. at noschedulemanpodcast.com. Also, if you're ever in iTunes, have a look for the Leader Feeder podcast. Leader Feeder podcast on iTunes with Greg Schinkel, and you'll pick up some great tips and insights from Greg through that podcast. If you liked this episode, I'm pretty sure you're going to love episode 67 with Dan Martell. It's called How Do I Create a Life I Love? And Dan is a terrifically successful entrepreneur, and more than that, just a terrific, wonderful human being. And you'll enjoy that episode number 67, How Do I Create a Life I Love with Dan Martell. Also related to business and authenticity and getting real to get results in business. In fact, that's what it's called. Episode 64 with Loretta Smith. Get real, get results. Tough business questions have simple answers. I enjoyed that discussion a lot. Episode 64 with Loretta Smith. Episode 60 with Jim Estel of Danby Appliances would also be high on my list of recommendations for you. It's called Putting People First. It's episode 60 of the No Schedule Man podcast. You can find all of those and all past episodes of this podcast worldwide on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, or at noschedulemanpodcast.com. If you're in the United States, you can find us on the U.S. feeds for iHeartRadio and Google Play Music as well. Again, if you'd like to connect with me, just look for No Schedule Man on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter, or visit me at kevinbolimer.com. NoScheduleMan.com will take you to the same place. You can learn more about my speaking, coaching, and other content there. And if you'd like to be a part of my online coaching community for daily access to me, encouragement, empowerment, and creative collaboration, visit theturtletribe.com. You'll find out everything you need to know. Thanks again for listening. If you found this helpful, please subscribe and do tell a friend. I hope to have you here again for the next episode of Journeys with the No Schedule Man.
Just a little